All right, so just as the sun has risen, so should our mind and our heart. Above all things, we ought to have courage. Courage in every moment gives us the opportunity to see things differently, right? So today, we're resting on day number 27 in our journey with vulnerability together. This journey has definitely been a eye-opening transition. It's been a real personal relationship, and just as many of us are aware, relationships sometimes have struggles, and sometimes they're beautiful, right? But either way it goes, it's getting to know vulnerability from many different lenses. And today, I'm excited. I'm excited because you guys can probably see this amazing, handsome young man. No, I'm not talking about myself. I'm talking about the other man that I have on here today. This young man has been an instrumental piece in my life. When I was a young child, I looked up to this young man. When I grew up and left Chicago to go to school in Virginia, I looked up to this young man. When I left Virginia and I just needed to know what stability from an emotional perspective looked like, I gleaned on this young man. This young man is my brother, Wayne Williams. So welcome, bro. Welcome, man. Welcome to the journey. So
thank you. I appreciate the love. Perfect,
man. Anytime, man. So tell me, if you get the opportunity, tell us, who is Wayne Williams? Who is Wayne Williams, and where you come from? Who are you? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I really just started finding out who Wayne Williams is over these last 5 years. And that's crazy, seeing that I'm almost 45 years old. But obviously grew up in Chicago Heights, Illinois. You know, that's where most of our family is, in Illinois. But left Bloom, went to Miami for my senior year, kind of life-altering change to go from Chicago to Miami. But shortly after that, decided to join the military. Did that for 20 years. So, and as with every other veteran, once you get out, your eyes open and you realize it's a different life out there. So everything that you train for in the military is not necessarily translatable into the civilian world, but a lot of those tools transition very well for me. So I'm here today, and these last 5 years has been a very eye-opening, eye-awakening experience. Like they say, with age comes wisdom.
I felt like you always had wisdom, man, at a young age. It's amazing to take a time and reflect and listen to your journey. But I always felt like you had wisdom. You always had the right thing to say at the right time. It always perceivably seemed that way. And I know inside it may be in a different situation within yourself on, having the right message or believing the right things, especially as it relates to the challenges we had growing up, right? Like, you were always that rock. So I guess my question to you, really, from a state of vulnerability, and the topic today we're going to be talking about is toxic masculinity. But before we get there, I think it's important to have context, right? So when we were growing up, we had different challenges. I was telling in my last episode that we were lock key kids, meaning come home from school, got a key, we're supposed to be at home. So mom comes home. Whether or not we stayed in the house, whatever. But during those times, they were very challenging, but you always seemed to be that rock, man. So what was it like growing up raising twins? Because you pretty much raised us for the most part, man.
Well, first let me start that off as part of that journey was being able to reflect on the childhood and realize how that's impacted me as a man. So, as with every adult, they're all faced with different challenges. So there's no blame placed on mom. There's no blame placed on dad or grandmommy, granddaddy, nana, da, or anyone in our lives. But for me, I was never in a permanent living situation. So I always bounced from household to household because that was necessary for other people's needs. So with that said, when it came down to being needed to help raise my brother and sister, as with everything else in life, you just adapt. How I adapted at such a young age, I don't have the answer for that. But, you know, growing up, we just had to do what we got to do, right? Don't make no excuses.
It seemed to
Just got to do what we got to do.
it, it definitely seemed that way, man. And you know, it's interesting that you say that because I think just even in this short conversation we've had so far, through my lens, and I'm sure other people can see your perspective in as it relates to responsibility is responsible. Your perspective as it relates to responsibility is responsible, and that's something that I always learned from you. That there's always a different way to look at things. It's generally not from the lens in which you look at it, because oftentimes that's where stress comes from. You know, how come I don't get what I want? How come things aren't going my way? You do very well at taking your perspective and replacing it with someone else's. As you mentioned, you know, other people were going through different things growing up, and it kind of helps you. It seems, and that's why you present yourself as whole, I think. And that's just from my lens. So I definitely wanted to slow down and acknowledge that. So now I really want to jump into the conversation, right? So masculine toxic masculinity has been a term that's been around for so long. And this concept really just derives from when men suppress their emotions or distress, right? Like anxiety, things like that, like putting that mask over it, so to speak. Also, too, it comes from maintaining an appearance of hardness, that ego. I got this together. You know, from our culture, especially when we grew up, like the ego mattered, man. Like you had to have some type of, you had to be somebody. Otherwise, you would get drowned in being nothing, right? And the last thing is violence being an indicator of power. So just even with those concepts, have you ever found yourself having to suppress emotions? And if that was the case, what do you think the result of that was, if that was the case, at any moment in your life? Did you ever have to suppress your emotions?
Uh, Typically, you suppress your emotions because you're raised that is a strength. Don't cry, you know.
Yeah,
Don't be emotional. Don't be a sissy or whatever adjective you want to use there. But that's what makes us unique, and that's what makes us who we are. Because if you can't express those emotions and be genuine, you suppress everything, you're going to have that volcano effect inside where you haven't been able to release adequately your emotions. So it's just building up. So I guess I am me. So I always just reacted the way that I felt necessary, whether that was emotional or whether it was to just have a calm demeanor and weather the storm and deal with it emotionally, you know, outside, just away from everybody else where they can visually see the emotional status, I guess you would say.
understand. I understand, and that's, to me, again. I keep re-echoing it, and as people listen, as I'm being vulnerable, the reason why I echo what I see in you is because it reminds me of the attributes I sometimes carry, right? Knowingly or unknowingly, and so to listen to you really explain that there was no real preference in trying to be somebody else. You just presented the best version of yourself you felt you need to be, right? And 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 for me, I almost felt that was completely opposite. And I shared this story with you. I remember one time, well, a lot of times actually, you would leave, go to school, because you would have to get up to school to go early. And I would get excited because I knew I could go into your closet to take some clothes so that I could wear to school and feel like I was cool, right? Like, and so I didn't realize, man, until I took a personal sense of reflection on my past, right, that I was chasing an image so strong to be accepted visually, but neglecting myself inwardly. And I allowed myself to have an excuse that I didn't have many people to show me the right way. But damn, it looks like I had you. Right? So what, what what about in the military? Was there ever a time where you all where you felt it was necessary to suppress? Because to me, I don't know much about it. I was never in the military, but I understand when they say do, you have to do. It's almost that sense of response. Did you ever learn to? Did you ever have to suppress, or did you? What was that like? I guess overall, how did that fit with your emotional context while you're in the military?
Well, in the military, you have to adapt to change all the time. So change is constant. So It's just like when we leave and you just asked about your emotions and showing it. So for the family, you're the one always leaving. So you have to be the one that's strong. Everybody else is being emotional. You know, dad's leaving this and that. So you're trying to exhibit that strength and be the strong one, even though you're emotional inside. So we're the ones picking up, leaving, coming back, picking up, leaving, rinse, repeat. But there are times in the military where maybe you expect to go home and be home, but you get extended. So
Wow.
you're forced with a choice to be emotional, but you can't change anything. So it's really wasted energy to be emotional about something you can't change. You just have to adapt, cope with it in that moment, and move on. So that's
Just
just a life
process.
lesson. Yeah, you
Yeah,
process it in that moment, deal with it, cope with it, move on.
makes sense. And that makes sense. And I oftentimes wonder, is that a cause of other things, right? And not specifically from our lens, but from anybody else's lens, because I think there are people, including myself, I can share in moments that I adapt, but I forget to address that emotion that I had, right? And it seeps in so many different areas, and I know that I could speak to that. But from your lens, you had recently just mentioned at the beginning of our conversation that you've been discovering yourself within the last 5 years, right? Did that discovery come from a place of introspective assessment on who you are on the inside? Like, walk us through that. What do you mean by that?
Okay, let me rewind for a minute just to what you just said about coping with moments. So you used to play basketball. So just to
Yeah.
elaborate, you know, when you shooting the ball, if you miss, can you dwell on that, or you got to forget that and go to the next shot? So
Now,
that
if you
correlates to
remember,
exactly what we're just talking about. You just got to keep shooting, right?
yeah,
You know, hey, give me this. I'm gonna
yeah,
keep shooting. It's gonna go in eventually. You got to have a short memory. So that just correlates to what I was
yeah,
just talking about. Is you adapt, you deal with it, and then you move on. So that's what the shooter's touch. You adapt in that moment. You got to forget the last shot and move on to the
that's true.
next one.
That's true.
So
I love that analogy. I love that analogy, especially because that analogy really enhances the conversation. Yes, in that moment, dwelling on it is definitely going to impact your game, your performance, your attitude, of course. But there's also a place of practice where that's where you address, okay, this time I'm going to continue to practice what I need to perfect. So there always has to be that space to develop. I like good. Okay, all right. That's it. Yeah, that's perspective. That's why that's perspective you be bringing to the world, man. Uh, but yeah, so
right,
as
but
we,
there's a time and a place for everything. So
yeah, 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 and especially in the society in which we live, sometimes you can't practice, unfortunately, on vulnerability, right? Exposing what's on the inside in certain areas because it could either be used against you or it could create a message that other people can interpret differently. Um, but I think it's important for myself, at least, to realize that opinions of others are just that and leave it there and don't let it connect, because then I start to suffer, if that makes sense, right? I start to
right,
identify with their words, and words are nothing more but just feedback, you know,
right.
pinpoints of
A lot of people don't associate with like your zodiac sign, but a lot of those traits are very true. So some people actually care about what other people think about you. I'm a Scorpio. I don't care what anybody thinks about me, so I can adapt and overcome in that moment. You know, I can care
yeah,
less what somebody thinks about me. I'm gonna handle my
yeah.
situation the way that I see fit. And if you like
Wow,
it, you
man.
like it. If you don't, you know. But not everybody's personality traits or their ability to adapt is the same. Some people are very, you know, they have a lot of empathy. So whenever someone has a judgment on them, that can be devastating to them.
Yes.
So when someone has a personal judgment of you and your character and how you're handling or coping with a situation, that's just
Wow.
teaching.
That really brings to light that it's important to have awareness too, because if that remains true, and that pattern of caring, that pattern of getting outside of oneself to care about someone else deeply, if you don't have that awareness on that pattern or that connection, I think it could be just like a drug or any kind of substance abuse, where it can take you to a dark place and you get lost. You're like, well, why am I depressed? It's because I wasn't aware there was a moment of attachment, right? And this attachment was not the first time I felt this way. So it's important, at least for me, and I'm kind of talking through my lens right now, because I have been going through a period of self-discovery as well. And my assessment is through paying attention to myself, paying attention to my reaction of my heart rate as it goes up when someone says something, paying attention to my breathing, shortness of breath, or whatever the case might be. And in the past, I didn't pay attention to that. I paid more attention to what other people said and what I wanted to get. And it's definitely creates some sense of refreshment. So what about you and your journey? You mentioned this transition that you are going into. What is that like for you? What does that mean?
Well, after my marriage kind of fell apart and you retire from the military and everything's kind of in chaos, you are in a very vulnerable place. And so as I got myself out of that and rebuilding my relationships with the family and friends and moving on and going from job to job, when I retired, I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I had to relearn myself. But in those moments, I feel like relationship to relationship, I learned a lot more about myself than I knew prior to that. So it was more like soul excavating and coping with deep thoughts about my childhood that actually correlated to my relationships failing. And I didn't put that together because I didn't think that that made any sense. But through the process of understanding and going back and being able to cope with not necessarily great memories, but just life in general. And then through each relationship, learning through each relationship and just trying to become a better version of myself. So right now I'm just hungry for more knowledge and learning and actually listening when someone's talking, processing the information, and then giving a response. The younger me would have just done like you said, is I hear what they say and I already have my comeback ready. So
Wow, man. And that's maturity. And you mentioned it earlier, the wisdom that you have. I appreciate that you just said a statement that was so important. And it's important enough to pause and reflect on. You say you do more listening now and you process to understand. And it's amazing. For me, when you said that, I even had to slow down in this moment and ask myself, am I listening? And even in that ask, I was aware that more information could be received because I wasn't in the state of listening. So it's almost like giving myself permission to receive. Listening gives yourself permission to receive more, and it's interesting, and forgive me if I go off, but your brother. But it's interesting that there's so much searching, there's so much stimulus on the outside with social media, with opinions of other people, with things changing so much, the attention is so much there. But then when there's an opportunity to cut that off, right, or to separate that and to pay attention to oneself as well as to the person that you're next to, that in and of itself is so much growth, right? And that's what I'm learning to do, because I felt that a lot of who I was connected again to what other people said or what I thought other people thought of me. And to find this space to listen to myself, to listen to other people, because you just said that, it almost makes me want to tear up, bro. Like, it makes me want to be like, man, like it's okay. You don't have to rush and listen so much to other people. You're in this moment now. Listen to this moment. And like, there's so much release that comes from that. turmoil that's held on, it's almost like it gives permission for things to release and to receive. It's almost like a wash, if you will. And so I'm grateful for that message. So I kind of got deep into that, but like, there's this other thing that you've been sharing with me recently about love, right? And if this is what you want, love it, whether it be a relationship or anything, right? What is your idea of love? And do you think as men, do we do a good job at it? What is your idea of love? Do you think as men, do you think we do a good job at it?
All right, I'll address that, but I won't address it as just men, because as women, as men, we are one. We are feminine, we are masculine, whether you choose to embrace that or not. But
Right.
the way I address love is to be the bar. Whether it's love, relationships, your job, you want to be the bar. You want to be the standard. So the person that comes after you, they have to meet that bar. Otherwise, they're inadequate. So in love, you got to go all in. Like when you're playing cards, poker, you're going all in every hand. I'm all in. But with love, there's great risk and there's great reward. It just depends on the situation. But if you're not willing to take the risk, you're not going to reap the benefits. But
Right.
you have to have a steady hand. You have to listen. You have to act. You have to have compassion for your partner. Why would you want to be in a relationship if you're not worried about your partner's well-being? If everything's all about you, I put me first.
Right.
Hey, go get me a beer. Okay, how would you feel if your wife told you to go get you a beer? Hey, go get me a beer. Oh, I don't like that. Well, why would you do that to her if you don't like that? You got to
Wow.
step outside of the relationship sometimes and put yourself in their shoes so you can understand. And you learn and
That's
you adapt relationship to relationship.
that requires patience. That requires honesty, and that definitely requires authentic self to be present. Right, like especially compassion. You said the key word compassion, which means to suffer with. And it's difficult to do that when you're selfish because you don't want to suffer. You always want to protect yourself. And I think that message can transcend to obviously relationships with whether it be spouses or just, even relationships as family and relationships even at work. That message you just delivered is really transcending in all those spaces. And it does require vulnerability to know whether or not you're participating effectively or not. So that's powerful, man, and I appreciate that. I'm sure everybody else who's open to receive is receiving it as well, man. So my last question for you. So, what does vulnerability mean to you, and why is it important?
To me, vulnerability is exactly what we're just talking about, where you can be vulnerable and you can feel okay with being vulnerable. Like I did everything that I could to salvage whatever relationship, your work, your job, as long as you put yourself out there and you can live with what you put in. If you turn around and you have to reflect when everything is over and the dust has settled and you have that 2020 vision and you can say, oh, well, I probably should have done that, then you weren't all in. Then you weren't as vulnerable as you could have been. Now, if you put it all in line and you're going to be as vulnerable as you can be and to risk it all, you can look back with an open heart and say, I'm good. And you can be okay with that. You could be okay with yourself again.
That's a pure version of vulnerability for sure. Is really being, and from what I hear you saying is, there's space in which you can look at your life even in the moment, and if you're not assessing whether or not you're putting everything in, or like you said, poker, you're all in or not. If you're not putting it all in, then it's going to impact your conscious, your emotion, and your retrospect look on your past. And we don't want to live with regrets, for sure. And it requires courage to put it all in. It requires courage, for sure. It definitely requires courage. And not so much
Also,
courage.
with that vulnerability, though, I'm sorry. Also, with that vulnerability, the major component to everything is communication. Because if you can't communicate your vulnerability and what you are putting on the table, if you can't communicate that, if you're not getting that in return, then what you don't get back is your fault as well. If you can't communicate that, like, I'm going all in, are you all in with me?
Ooh, that's woo. You doing a Thanksgiving spread right now. You making people sit down and eat. That's gonna take a while to eat. We're gonna get the itis after we eat all that information. You better go to sleep after you receive all that. Jeez, that is lessons to lean on, to think of, to receive, and to apply. And the application will definitely allow the opportunity to reap what we sow. Reap in good times, reap in happiness, reap in satisfaction, reap in contentment, and just reap in the sense of knowing that we're all connected because we put it all in. And even if it doesn't work, even if there's challenges, the fact that it was all put on the table, from a pure heart, it's easier to overcome those things. It's so much easier to overcome those. It's almost like you look for challenges to see how much more you can put in. And then that's where that momentum and motivation really, really thrives. And that's a thriving relationship right there. And so I appreciate you, man. I appreciate you. I love you. And this is not the last time we're going to do this, for sure.